This happened when I was around 9 or 10. I was staying the night at my friend Catherine's for the first time. We met the summer before and were inseparable ever since. Kat lived in this old 2-story house surrounded by woods and dirt road. The house itself gave me an uneasy feeling when I first saw it. The shutters were falling off. The paint on the house seemed to be fading. It was an old piece of crap now that I think about it, but at the time I was nervous and excited. I remember walking in after I stared at the house for what seemed like 20 minutes. Surprisingly, the inside was a lot nicer than the outside, so I pushed that uneasy feeling down and just shrugged it off as nerves. I remember the smell of the house. I can't pinpoint it, but it was different, like walking into a musty room. I started to walk around just to explore my surroundings, but I noticed Kat's mom watching me. I simply smiled and waved, but she just stood there staring at me wide-eyed. I've never met her before, but why was she looking at me like that? Suddenly, Kat flew around the corner and tackled me. We both fell and started to giggle. I noticed Kat's mom out of the corner of my eye start to turn around and walk off. She was gone, just like that. Fast forward a couple hours. Kat and I are laying on a beanbag in her room watching Children of the Corn, which, by the way, was one of my favorite movies at the time. I grew up watching horror movies, mostly Stephen King or any movie my mom was watching. Not her decision, mine, because I love the feeling that a good horror movie gives you. She felt the same way, and that's why we clicked so much. Back to the story. We were sitting here watching this movie, and suddenly the door opposite us slams closed. We both jumped, giggled, and brushed it off because, well, we were kids. Until the second time, when it creaked open and slammed again, not even seconds after the first time. Now I'm sitting there staring at this door trying to figure out how in the hell it's opening and closing by itself. In the midst of all that, the only other person in this house is her mom, who I figured out earlier was just a tad bit creepy. "You think it's just your mom?" I asked her, but she shook her head. "You sure?" I asked again, but she said something that gave me chills, and still gives me chills, just telling this story. "My mom isn't home. It's just me and you, silly." I just stare at her while she's staring at me, trying to wrap my head around what she had just told me. "Where is your mom?" I asked her. "She's at work." I giggled, thinking that she was just trying to trick me. "She is at work. She only works for a couple hours, so she leaves me here because she trusts me." At this point, I'm just looking at her, and she noticed this look of concern on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked. "If your mom is at work, then who was that lady looking at me earlier?" As I said this, we heard what seemed like footsteps at the time, but thinking about it now, it sounded like shuffling in one spot above us. I'm completely terrified at this point. Every hair on my neck is standing on end, and I just want to leave. I start to get up when Kat pulled me back down and asked me if I had heard the noise. I nodded. It was silent again until the footsteps were back, but louder and faster. We both gazed up at the ceiling and she grabbed my hand. "This happens every day," she whispered. I look over at her and can truly see the fear on her face. The footsteps stopped and she looked at me, her face flushed white. "Is there an attic?" I asked. She pointed up toward the ceiling. "Well, maybe it's just squirrels or birds," I kept thinking over and over. "You ever notice when you're really quiet? That's when you can hear almost everything around you. Imagine if you're sitting in a house with your best friend alone at 10 years old and you hear the giggle of a 3-year-old child. Mind you, she has no younger brothers or sisters. We were completely alone. Kat was just as scared as I was. I remember thinking that I just wanted to get out of the house. Just grab her and run out the door. At least we would feel safer and less scared outside than we would in. "Want to hear a story?" Kat asked, pulling my mind back to reality. I nodded. "Well, this house used to be a daycare. There was this lady that would watch the kids, and one day she just locked them in the attic and then hung herself from a rope in the kitchen. They all died because the kids were hungry and thirsty and no one found them for months. In this house." My heart started to pound. My eyes were wide with fear. "It's true," she said. I've seen them, the little kids, every day. But I never saw the lady, but you have. Earlier. After she told me this, I don't remember much else aside from running out the door of her room and making it outside that house. Kat followed, begging me to stay, but I just had to leave. My stomach felt like it was in knots. I felt like I had walked into a horror movie myself, and just wished that this day had never happened. Fast forward to years later. That was the last day that I had seen or heard from Kat. I remember her always coming to play outside at my dad's during the day. I remembered what she looked like. I remembered meeting her parents and seeing them out in public. I'm now 27, and I can't seem to find any proof that she even existed. All my friends that I was friends with then, I'm still friends with now, even after all these years. But why not her? I drove by that house maybe 15 times, and still wonder if maybe she was just one of the ones that never made it out. About a month ago, I started a new job doing security at a local community college. Being the new guy, I was pretty much shafted with the night shift right off the bat. Normally, I work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. on weekdays, and 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. on the weekends. It's a nice job, good pay, plenty of overtime. The campus doesn't have dorms, and I'm the only one here at night. It gets lonely and very quiet. Watching the security cameras is monotonous, and patrolling the empty dark halls can only be done for so long before boredom really starts to set in. When I first started, I had the expectation that I would be given the worst shift at the worst times, and I was right. I was put on the night schedule before I even got to see the place, really. It used to be an old Catholic academy for girls until the late 60s. It isn't particularly secluded, but more suburban. It sits up on a hill overlooking a highway. It has 5 floors in the new part of the building, 4 floors in the old convent and chapel wings. It was first opened in the 1890s by a religious order of nuns, particularly for young ladies who also wanted to be nuns. It grew out of that until eventually attendance dwindled, and it was sold to the state, who in turn converted it into a community college after almost a decade of disrepair. I'm not someone who dabbles in the occult or knows a lot about the supernatural. I mind my own business and try to do my job. But recently, this place has got me in rare form. I don't scare easily now. But just in the short time that I have worked here, I've started to think that something is up. The security cameras are typical CCTV cameras. No audio recordings. But in the monitor, I'll hear a crackling like static. There's no way to enable or disable audio on the monitor. It comes and goes. I'll hear footsteps like leather soles clopping down the hallways through the security monitor. When I go on patrols in the convent wing, the lockers that are typically reserved for the cleaning crew and faculty staff will be unlocked and wide open. I've seen them open on the cameras, but only my supervisor can play back the footage. Doors that I know I locked during my first patrol will then be unlocked and open on the third patrol. The motion sensors will detect something and turn on when I'm not even on that floor, and when I am, sometimes they don't even react to when I move down the hall. And when I go to what is now the library, it used to be the chapel, I can hear piano music coming from the hall where I had just came from. I don't really drink anymore. I don't do any drugs, prescribed or not. There's no history of mental illness, and this isn't just a one-time thing. I'm not sure how to tell my supervisor about it without sounding mad or cowardly. I don't even know if I'm posting this in the right area. Only 4 more hours left in my shift, anyway. This is the story of the time I saw an apparition that looked as if it crept right off the silver screen. This encounter happened in the late summer, early fall of 2007. I was in the 4th grade and my family had just moved to the absolute boonies of Mississippi. I was born in Mississippi and still had a lot of family down there, but my father had been stationed in another state for the previous several years. Military. So I guess you could say we were moving back home. My parents were in the market to buy a house, but until they found one, we would be staying with my great-aunt and her family. My aunt had a beautiful but slightly run-down 100-and-something-year-old home in the woods on the outskirts of an abominably small town. In order to get to her home, you had to drive down a 1-lane dirt road through the woods. On this particular afternoon, my sisters and my cousin, who was about our age, were playing tag in the front yard of my aunt's home. Now, you need to know a little bit about the layout of this yard. The yard was longer than it was wide. Picture a rectangle with the house on one end and the dirt roadway at the other end of it. If you're looking at the house from the road, the right side of the yard is bordered by muddy soil, thick trees, and bamboo that creates a sort of natural border to the property. On the other side of the yard is a length of tropical leafy bushes about waist high that run from the front of the porch almost down to the road separating the yard from the driveway, just on the other side of the plants. Near the road in the middle of the yard was a ginormous old oak tree dripping with Spanish moss. Now back to the game. This particular round of tag, I was it. My siblings and cousin were running around the yard and the house, trying to hide behind various things. As I was scanning the yard, I noticed the figure of a girl with long, straight brown hair, peeping her head out from behind the big oak tree. She was wearing a dress that fell below her knees, which was very different from what the rest of us kids were wearing, namely cut-off jean shorts and stained t-shirts. I thought it was odd to see someone there, since I could have sworn that I saw all of the girls run in the opposite direction toward the house, but I figured I would go and check it out anyway. As I made it to the tree, I looked behind the trunk, and there was no one there. I was beyond confused at this point. My 10-year-old brain didn't immediately jump to ghost. It was more along the lines of, who the heck was that? The tree was in the center of the yard, with no other trees or shrubbery within 20 or so yards, so if the girl would have run up from behind the tree, I should have seen her. By that point, I started scanning the yard, and my eyes happened to fall to those tropical bushes that bordered the driveway. Crouching down near the bushes was the same figure of the girl. I remember her squatting near the leaves and peering in my direction when I noticed that she had no face. She was completely absent of any facial features, eyes, lips, and nose. Her face was just a smooth expanse of flesh-colored skin. It looked like something straight out of Silent Hill. I must have looked away, and then she was gone. I have never seen this apparition since. Now, I honest to goodness recall this encounter just as I have described above, but it was also 14 years ago. It's quite possible that my memory is faltered in some aspects, or as exaggerated in others, but this is how I recall it. Either way, it was terrifying. Most of this stuff happened to me between the ages of 10 and 18. I've posted before about my haunted school, and I'd like to share more of what I've heard. Whatever these things are, they have really enjoyed screwing with me periodically. I was 17 and had just gotten home from some event, either with a church group or some friends, I don't recall. It was about 11 p.m., and as mandated, I woke my parents up to let them know that I was home and alive. Don't remember why I felt the need to shower that night, but I did. The shower was a stall with a glass door and really high-pressure steam, which was almost deafening in that plastic stall. You would have to shout at me right next to the bathroom door in order for me to hear you. So that's why what happened next was so shocking. Mid-shower, there was this loud, blood-curdling female scream that I could hear from inside the shower. I had never heard someone scream like that in real life, and it paralyzed me for a second. I have 2 sisters, and so I immediately thought the worst. I busted out of the shower, ran to my parents' room dripping wet, wearing only a towel, fully expecting my parents to be getting up to see who was screaming. The house wasn't that big, just a double-wide trailer with an addition. I was shocked to find them in bed asleep still. Their door was open. If I heard the scream, then they should have really heard it, especially since neither of them are heavy sleepers. I woke them quickly and asked if they had heard that scream, which they didn't. Mom was concerned, and Dad hopped out of bed and we checked on my siblings. All sound asleep. So then we searched the house and even looked outside. Nothing. He usually gets annoyed and upset when I talk about the paranormal. He had to exorcise some evil spirit from a room when he was on his mission at age 20, so he prefers to have them just not exist at our house at all, and no scary movies. But this time he was pretty calm, probably because he could tell how upset that I was. I wasn't dreaming, hallucinating, or making it up, and he knew it. I was standing naked with a towel, nearly hyperventilating and still dripping from the shower. Dad tried to comfort me, telling me it was probably just a cat outside. Yeah, really. He didn't believe it, but that's what he was selling, so I better buy it. I really had nothing else to do but go to bed, down in the basement where most of the activity occurred, but you bet your butt I didn't sleep much. Whatever it was that was screaming would bug me periodically. I was the only one in the basement, so naturally, I was the only witness. I have lots of stories that my family still won't believe. I work in a pharmacy that's located inside a nursing home, and I've been working there for the past 4 years. Just a note to mention, I've had many prior paranormal experiences in my life, but this is still ongoing. I've always felt a presence since the first week that I started, but it was never anything that made me feel threatened. Things didn't really start happening until last year, when I was talking to my coworkers about feeling a presence, and asking if that was something that they had experienced as well. The day after I had a conversation with my coworker, I was working a night shift. On our night shifts, there's only one technician and a pharmacist. I was sitting at the back counter on my computer when I thought that I had seen someone come through the door. We're usually not busy at night, but there is the odd time when one of the nurses will come down for a bag of chips or a pop. I got up from where I was seated and walked over to where our cash register was, and from there you can see the pop coolers and the chip racks. I couldn't see anyone, so I left and walked back and forth, looking down the aisles. Nobody was there. I asked my coworker if he had seen anyone come in, and he said no. But I was 99.9% sure that someone had walked through that door. I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I decided that I was probably just tired. I sat back down in my chair and started filling prescriptions. About 25 minutes later, I looked up and saw a pack of toilet paper slowly moving forward to the edge of the shelf before it dropped on the ground, startling me. There's absolutely no way that it could have just been our air system or a draft that had knocked it off. My coworker saw this too, and also thought it was odd. I told him it was a spirit that moved it, and he looked at me like I had 5 heads. So, to prove my point, I brought up the security camera footage. On the video, you can see two bright and fairly large orbs moving around as the toilet paper was being moved. I showed it to him, and there was no denying that it was a spirit trying to make itself known. That was my first significant paranormal experience at the pharmacy. We've had things go missing only to find them in the strangest places. For example, my car keys went missing one day from my locker, only for me to find them in with the prescription vials. My coworkers all swore up and down that nobody had hidden them there, and I most definitely didn't. Things are always falling off of the shelves, and sometimes they're heavy items, not just something light like the toilet paper incident. We had a 5-kilogram jug of Epsom salts crash onto the ground and break open, and no one was even remotely close to the aisle. Many of my coworkers and I see what looks like someone walking by out of the corner of our eye, only to realize that no customers are in the store. We also hear what sounds like the door to the front entrance open and close, and nobody is coming in. This happens multiple times a day, sometimes. The only time I've ever felt threatened or scared so far was when I was working the night shift and got locked in the bathroom. It could well have been a hardware malfunction, but I don't believe that it was. The handle locked from the inside, and I don't normally lock it anyways. I did my business, flushed the toilet, and washed my hands. I went to exit the seemingly unlocked door and felt that it was being held shut from the other side. I figured it was just my coworker messing with me, so I started yelling his name, and that it wasn't very funny, and to let me out. The handle started moving as if someone was on the other side, wiggling it. I yelled again for my coworker, and he must have finally heard me because I could hear his footsteps. He asked what was wrong, and then pulled the door open with ease. He's now finally starting to believe that I wasn't crazy, and that this place actually has some paranormal activity going on. I live in England in a 2-story flat, and I have always believed in the paranormal, but my dad does not believe in any type of ghost or anything supernatural. I never thought that this flat was haunted. However, as I got older, I started to feel uncomfortable by myself, and I saw shadows downstairs out of the corner of my eye. Now, there is an attic directly above our second floor, but there is no way for us to enter it, as you cannot access it from this flat. The only way to access this attic is by having a specific key that can open the attic, as it is council flats, which is above my neighbor's house. However, the attic above my flat is the only one which is blocked off, and there is no way to enter it. I have the last flat on the end of these 18 council flats. There are no neighbors above us, just the attic, which no one can access without that key, and they would still not be able to get above our flat. One night about 2 years ago, all of the family was in bed, and it was about 3 in the morning. All of a sudden, I heard something crash above. It was so loud that it woke all my family members up, and we all got up and stood on the landing together. After that bang, we heard 3 loud footsteps, and the sound of something being dragged behind these footsteps. It was so scary, as we know that nobody can physically get up there. My dad was not convinced that it was a ghost. He thought that somebody had somehow gotten into the attic, so he went outside to check if the communal attic door was opened. I followed him outside, and it was completely padlocked shut with heavy chains around the lock. I tried to explain to him, how can there be anyone up in our part of the attic when it's blocked off and impossible to get into? We came back into the house, and we were all quite shaken up. My brother was young, and was able to get to sleep, but I was awake all night. After this experience, I started to smell old cigarette smoke every time I would enter my toilet, and it was so stale and stagnant. After the event, me, my brother, and my mom were going away on holiday, whilst my dad had to stay there and work. He told me he slept with his headphones in every night, as even he felt uncomfortable by himself. As a family, we still have no idea what those noises were, and since then we have heard many strange things. I've had several unexplained encounters which I guess you could say are paranormal. I've never believed in that kind of stuff until the experience that I'm going to tell you now. There's a creek below my house where me and my friend would go to hang out when we were kids. It was away from everyone, where we could do whatever we wanted to. We'd normally build a fire and just chill and bring a radio so that we could listen to music. One day I decided that we should go fishing since we never have down there and there's a bunch of deep spots that are perfect for it. So I get my grandpa's old fishing rod. It was literally a piece of bamboo with a fishing line tied to it. I don't know why, but I just wanted to test it out. He brought his dad's old fishing pole. Both my grandpa and his dad had unfortunately passed away years ago. We pack everything up and head down. We decide first to start fishing near the entrance to the creek because there's a few deep spots there. So we bait our hooks and I throw my line in and he does second. As we're waiting for a bite, my friend tells me someone is coming. I turn around and see no one, yet he says he can hear walking. I keep looking and soon I see a man coming around the corner wearing a hat and overalls. He's very dirty as well, like he just got done working on a car or something. When he sees us, he stops and stares. My friend starts freaking out and telling me to get my knife, since I always carry one. I, however, feel like he wasn't a threat, and just watched him. My friend has always been nervous around strangers and has a fear of them. He begins walking toward us without a word, and stops only a few feet away from my friend. He doesn't seem to acknowledge me and doesn't even look at me and my friend. He stares at him without uttering a word. My friend finally speaks up and says, "Can I help you?" The man simply replies, "Have you seen my wife and kids?" He also calls my friend by name. My friend replies, "No, I haven't seen anyone else down here." The man says nothing and walks away, and as he walks around the corner, I follow him, and as I look around the corner, he vanishes. I see no trace of him, and there's no place he could have gone except straight, because there's fences on both sides. I look back at my friend and tell him he's gone. My friend tells me that's not possible unless he could run extremely fast uphill. I then asked if he knew him because he called him by name, but he swears he has no idea who the man was and has never seen him before. We both decided that was enough for one day, packed everything up, and left. We never saw him again, though we've been down there hundreds of times since that incident. Not long ago, however, I stumbled upon a gravestone hidden in thick grass at the same creek. It was a man who died in the 1970s, who was also a Vietnam veteran. The first and only time I've ever seen a ghost, a dead person, a demon, whatever you want to call it, was exactly 1 year ago today. I had just gotten my bachelor after 3 years of studying social welfare and was now working at a group home for teens with substance use problems. My workplace was in a big old house, which was almost scary quiet during the nighttime, and I often felt anxious being there. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoyed the job and spending time with the teens, but working nights scared the crap out of me. I usually started my shift around 8 p.m. Around that time we often made dinner. I helped out with homework, and we talked for hours dealing with all sorts of issues until I went to bed, usually around 1 a.m., and this was one of those days. I fell asleep at 1:30, woke up 2 hours later like I usually do to get a glass of water. I walked down the stairs, entered the common room, and then walked by a big window in the living room. I looked up at the gray, cloudy sky when I saw death hanging in a tree. Brown, rotten flesh in the shape of a face. I rubbed my eyes, and then looked again, and the flesh was still there. I couldn't move, breathe, or blink my eyes for a few seconds. I was absolutely terrified. After a while, I found the strength to move my legs, and walked into the office again. I locked the door and sat there all night, and when the sun finally peeked out, I managed to move my legs to go and look out the window again. There was no rotten flesh this time, just a normal tree with green leaves. A few days later after this incident, I told my boss that I didn't want to work night shifts anymore since the lack of sleep. I didn't want to tell her the real reason, since she would probably think that I was mad. Maybe I was. And what if this was just a nightmare? Probably. But what if it wasn't? When I was around 15 or so, my mom and stepfather got divorced in a pretty dramatic way. It's like the whole household was just turned upside down. Everyone's routines were off. Mom was out doing something most nights after work. My little sister spent more time with her friends. And I became something of a night owl, usually waiting until the wee morning hours to lie down. Our house was a simple one in a rural area. 2 stories, with a huge backyard sharing a fence with a cow pasture and the entrance to some thick woods. The house had a lot of problems, but I enjoyed taking over the maintenance and gardening work as they gave me something to do when I was feeling depressed. For some perspective, our kitchen windows looked out directly to the fence described above. The left half of the fence bordered one of the back corners of the big cow pasture, while the right half bordered the entrance to the woods, which had a rather overgrown trailhead just barely visible from the kitchen window. For the most part, though, all you could see was overgrown grass and shrubbery, at least 4 or 5 feet high, and some low-hanging trees of mixed oak and cedar. This backdrop added a sort of eerie tranquility to our property, which I appreciated from the first day we moved in. One night, I took a break from my homework after realizing I had stayed up way too late on a Thursday, even for my standards. I went downstairs to make some food, and my dog followed me like she always did. I made a grilled cheese, and while I was at the sink cleaning the pan, I noticed some of the grass from the wood line start to shuffle around. It startled me at first, but as soon as I began to fixate on it, I saw no more disturbance. We lived in wildlife country at the time, so I figured it was probably a deer, coyote, or a cougar. Unsurprising for the latter, given that the farmer who owned the pasture had dozens of cows and sometimes didn't bring them in at night. Strangely, though, I noticed this for several more nights, always when I was doing the dishes after eating. I would look out the window, see the grass shuffle around, then see nothing further when I fixated on the spot. I was always a fan of scary movies, and I tended to be a jumpy kid, so each time I convinced myself I wasn't really seeing any sort of pattern. This changed, though, when my dog would start fixating on the woods herself and barking at night. Furthermore, our motion sensor security light would begin to stay activated sometimes for hours on end, only switching off when I would get to the kitchen to make my midnight snacks. Eventually, I told my mom about all this, and while she initially seemed concerned, she pointed out that we did live behind the woods after all, and so we should expect animals or occasional homeless squatters near our property. She said that if I was concerned, I could always call the police or animal control. I didn't disagree, and for the most part gave the matter no further thought. One night, though, I decided that a 1 a.m. dip in our hot tub in the backyard sounded good. I changed, and my dog and I went outside. I climbed in, closed my eyes, and zoned out like usual. I was whipped awake when I heard a loud crunch, followed by what sounded like someone falling over into some bushes. I stood up, turned around, and shouted, "Who's there?" But no one replied. It was dead silent, and I had the creeps. I put my robe on and went inside. The next day, I told my neighbor friend and crush about this, and she thought I was being ridiculous, but nonetheless agreed to go with me to check out that part of the woods to see if there was any evidence of anyone or anything hiding in the direction that I had heard the noise coming from. We stomped through the woods until we got to where we could see the back of my house. We checked every shrub and every blackberry bush, but found nothing. It was probably a coyote or something, deciding on whether or not you'd make a good dinner, the neighbor girl said, snarking. I playfully flipped her off, then laughed, quietly relieved that there was no creepy person stalking me the previous night. Well, of course, I might have been wrong about that, because that night, when I was making my usual sandwich, our security light came on, and I raced to the back door to see what was up. I saw what I could barely make out to be a shadowy, 6-foot-tall or so figure disappear from the trail and into the brush to the right of it. My heart skipped a beat, and my dog, probably sensing my nerves, began barking wildly. I opened the door and shouted, "The fuck's out there? Come out!" Of course, there was nothing but silence. After sitting in the dining room for an hour, I figured that I was being paranoid and seeing what I was subconsciously afraid of being out there. I called my neighbor back, and she, surprisingly, did not call me crazy and told me she would tell her dad about it in the morning. I never saw this sort of thing again, and my neighbor's dad chalked it up to being a homeless person camping out in the woods. Or, at the very most, a stalker from one of the houses around ours. Something he explained wouldn't be surprising as my sister was quite a looker, and he thought it made sense that she would have a stalker, as if this was supposed to make me feel better. Well, I suppose it did in the end, as months passed and I forgot about it fairly quickly. That is, until a local news bulletin came out about a sexual predator having been recently apprehended by local police, after a report from a couple living a few houses down from us was filed about the wife being approached by the tall and gaunt man in the evening hours as she was watering her garden boxes. She said he suddenly appeared, quietly as if he were trying to sneak up on her. When she noticed him, she demanded his name, but he darted back into the woods. She called the sheriff immediately, and half an hour or so later the department combed through the woods and apprehended the man, who was hiding under a fallen tree. All the report said was that the man claimed he was living in the woods for months, surviving on snacks from a nearby gas station, and would not give a reason for why he was out there. However, he was apparently wanted for numerous sexual offenses on minors and vulnerable adults some years prior, whatever those ended up being. Now, years later, I still get uncomfortable looking into the woods at night, anywhere I live. Who can blame me? I was born a twin, but my twin sister died at birth. So did all 6 children my parents had after me. Those died pretty early into the pregnancy, so it was mostly miscarriages. My twin was the only one who took a few breaths before passing. I'm the only one who survived and grew up to be the adult I am today. I only lived in one house during my entire lifetime, until recently when I got to finally move out. There's good reason for that. I learned about my siblings, especially my twin sister, when I was 14 years old. But when I was a first grader, I would wholeheartedly believe that I wasn't an only child, and tell my teachers and the other children about my sister who I was playing with and sharing a room with. By the way, I don't have actual memories of this because no one was there. But I didn't lie for attention. I genuinely believed that. I had a fair share of trauma and mental illnesses in my life already, so when I started to hallucinate disfigured shadows and children in my house at age 12, I went to see a therapist, and it was deemed a symptom of my PTSD. The shadows would form a kind of uncanny young girl's shape most of the time. Until recently, I just discovered these hallucinations were side effects of my admittedly fragile mental state, since the encounters really scared me. Sometimes it even felt like it would talk to me in a weird, unfriendly way. They stopped at the age of 14, when my mother finally told me about my siblings. But still on the staircase to my room and around the dinner table where those things appeared, I would feel watched or even chased, especially at night. Sometimes when I'm awake late, I hear footsteps up the stairs to my room, but they just stop in front of the last step and don't go back down, but seem to start from the bottom again a few minutes later. This changed when I got together with my boyfriend. He started sleeping over and spending more time at the house naturally, and I never told him about my scary encounters. So when we were still up at night and the footsteps occurred, which I had learned to ignore quite well, he looked up from his phone screen, clearly alerted, and my stomach dropped. He's a skeptic, so after he mentioned how the sounds were weird, he quickly got his mind off of it. A few weeks later, my boyfriend went to the bathroom at night. In the morning, he told me how weird he felt walking up the stairs. He felt like someone was watching or chasing him. I never told him about how I always felt this exact thing when I walk up those stairs. Those occurrences with him started piling up, until I got genuinely terrified of staying longer than necessary in that godforsaken house. Right after I turned 18 earlier this year, I started working my hardest to afford to move out. And I finally did it last week. So far, I haven't had scary encounters in my new home. Something is telling me that it was her the whole time. Since I was a child, she's been tormenting me. The way my skeptic boyfriend experienced it, the same exact way, without knowing, convinced me. I am not crazy. When I was a kid, I lived in a one-story house that had a very small space that you could consider an attic. We didn't keep anything up there because it was such a small space. I don't even know where the entrance to it was, if there was one. But, and this started right as we moved in, after we would go to bed, I lived with my grandparents, I would start hearing footsteps up there. I knew they were footsteps because they would move in a rhythm and go from one end of the house to the other. I lived in that house from when I was 8 to 12 years old, and this happened every night. I repeatedly tried telling my grandparents about this, and they always said it was just the house settling. I was never able to sleep well as a kid, so while my grandparents would be asleep as soon as 8 p.m. struck, I would be lying awake in bed staring at the ceiling. It was always the most terrifying when the footsteps stopped right above me, like right over my bed, and then in a few seconds to minutes they would walk back to some other location up there. Nobody ever believed me that this was happening. My granddad had even found holes that had apparently been drilled in several of the walls, one in the bathroom, and he wrote it off as a previous owner running cables through the walls. Lived in that house for 4 years, and was convinced that someone was living in the ceiling above us and would become active when they thought that we had gone to sleep. I'll never forget that. It always happened at the same time of night, right after we went to bed. This was back in the late 90s to the early 2000s, so I don't know if there could have been cameras or something that they could have been watching us on, but they definitely knew when we went to bed. I'm still to this day convinced that someone was up there. Paranormal? I don't know. It's worth mentioning that one of the previous owner's kids did die in the house. They had a wolf-dog hybrid as a pet that mauled him in the living room. Anyway, I thought I'd share that because literally no one believed me, ever, to this day. But I know that footsteps are different from houses settling. This would go on into the wee hours of the morning, and I would usually finally pass out when the footsteps had gone off to a different part of the house. In 2007, I moved into the house I currently live in. It's over 100 years old, and ever since I can remember there have been weird or creepy things that occur. Recently I've heard noises late at night while I'm in bed. For context, I sleep on the top floor of my house, and it's been getting really creepy. Another thing is that in the hallway we have an attic door that's bolted shut and hasn't been opened by our family or my neighbors who used to live here from what I have been told. I decided to ask my father about it, and he told me that it wasn't a full-size attic and is more of a crawl space which goes right over my room. And the part that creeps me out the most is that we've never had any animals besides the occasional mouse in our home, which makes me think that what I'm hearing doesn't sound like an animal at all. This is one of the unexplained series of events and the existence of the unknown in my very intimate environment. Location. My grandma's apartment is in one of the populous areas of Yangon's downtown, which is a 30-year-old apartment that has no record of criminal activity or any violent events whatsoever. The place? There's a room in this apartment that is always gloomy and subsequently felt ominous whenever a living soul would pass around it or in it. It's a typical, normal bedroom. Queen-sized bed, modern furniture, and a picture of Jesus Christ in it. Even though there's nothing abnormal about the room itself, the aura that it gave out is evil. It used to be my late grandpa's room, in which he was suffering from hepatitis C. The problem. The room itself is locked now and no one lives in it, since it used to cause the house members and guests chills whenever a person or just someone would pass around the room unexpectedly. Whenever you look inside it, there's no one. Sometimes a 3-second long snickering laugh in a low tone can be heard. This can happen at any time of the day. Sometimes there's nothing at all. But whenever a person tries to lay on the bed of that room, everyone who's done it has said that they felt someone is watching them with an evil smile. But it's just their feeling, including mine. Another common denominator is that we cannot identify how that evil looks or where it came from. We all know that something is just there. What all of the house members and guests agree on is that something is watching the bed, as previously stated, with an evil smile. The aftermath. Even though no one goes near there and the room is locked since my grandpa's death, we are all worried due to the frequent sounds and laughter that we can hear at any random time. My aunt, who lives with my grandma at the same apartment, said that clapping can also be heard at a certain time of night, but not regularly. But it can't be anything from upstairs coming down, because upstairs is an empty hall that's been cleaned and locked by the previous owners until they find another renter. These events are strange since they didn't happen right away after my grandparents moved in. It started happening like a decade after they've been living there. The rest is history. I hope you all can tell me what it is. All the family members are questioning to this day. One night, I was working a night shift in a refinery. I was working as a quote-unquote hole watch for my shift, which means I basically sit at an entrance and document anyone that goes in and out. Well, a guy showed up, I got his name, and he gave me the company that he worked for, so I logged him in. Everything checked out, so I'm waiting at the entrance for a few hours for the guy to come back out. Now, that's nothing unusual, because most of the people that go in will stay in there between 2 to 6 hours at a time, and every hour or two I yell up to make sure that they're okay. I would yell, and usually the guys whistle back or make a noise to let me know that everything's alright, and every time I check, I thought I heard a response. A few more guys came up to go in. I logged them in, let them know that there's another guy up there doing inspections. They go in and radio back, "Hey, there's no one in here." Immediately, I had a weird feeling because I was at the only exit entrance, so there's no possible way to get out of the container without me seeing. The way the container is set up, you have to climb up a ladder to get into it from underneath using a scaffold to help. I was sitting on the scaffold far back enough to where if anybody came out, they would drop down right in front of me, and the only way off of it was to go through the gate opening that I was guarding. So I radio my foreman and explained to him what had happened. He got into contact with the company and they had no one by that name and no one scheduled to check that particular container. I was completely baffled at this point. Here I am, adamant as ever that someone went up into that container. I thought I was going crazy and I was also a little weirded out. I had a signature on the log where they sign in, and I have to sign right next to their name also, acknowledging that I know that they're going in. For about 20 minutes, I'm in full panic mode and freaking out because I don't have an explanation as to what happened, or where he went, or who he was. And on top of that, I could have easily lost my job because of it. I grew up in the country in North Carolina. I lived up in the woods where there used to be a water mill. A family lived there back in the 40s. The parents had 2 daughters and 1 son. Unfortunately, one of the daughters got caught under the water wheel and drowned. Ever since I was a kid, I always heard humming and low singing in the woods when I was out tromping around. But one thing that really scared me one night is when I was older. I worked for the sheriff's office, and I had left work early one night due to being over on my hours. I got home around 2:30-ish, and when I pulled up, I saw the figure of a little girl standing right beside my garage. When I got out of my car, she was gone. The next experience I had was when I was out hunting in the same woods. It was super quiet, a beautiful fall evening. I had just gotten down into my stand when all of a sudden I started hearing the same humming and singing I had heard multiple times over the years. But then I heard what sounded like someone walking toward me. I looked around everywhere and couldn't see anything. Then I heard a laugh, but not the same laugh as before. So as I was climbing down my tree stand, a rock hit my boot. And once again, I heard the laughing. Now mind you, the area where I was hunting was about 3 miles deep in the woods, and there was no one around. I brought my brother and cousin and a few friends down there one night, and we were gonna just sit and listen and see if we could hear anything. We were down there playing cards, joking around, when all of us heard what sounded like someone in distress. We all got quiet and listened, and we could hear what sounded like someone breathing heavily. And the thing that confuses me about that night was if it was the little girl, or something more dark. Sometimes I think things are better left alone. I think my paranormal story began when I was around 5 or 6 years of age. I was a shy and quiet little girl, but nothing in my life was out of the ordinary. I had both of my parents married, and a little brother 3 years younger than me that was sleeping in the same room as me. I don't know exactly how or when it all began, but things started to get weird at night in my bedroom. Every time my mother put me to bed and turned off the lights, shadows would begin to move around and scare me. By shadows, I mean black entities, like little insects crawling on the walls, standing figures with human shapes, even faces. I was so terrified of the night that I had a hard time falling asleep, and I can't recount how many times I had to turn on my little bed light to chase away the shadows that I was seeing. Nothing bad ever happened to me during those days. These shadows were always just passing by or staring at me, even though I recalled some times that were scarier than others. I remembered one particular night when I opened my eyes and there was just a face, centimeters away from mine, staring at me with dead eyes. I was on top of a bunk bed. Every time something scary would happen to me, my instinct was to turn on a light. Everything disappeared with the light, so I made a habit to save myself like this. And now, at 26 years old, I still need to turn on the lights everywhere I go because I cannot feel at ease in the dark. Of course, I told my experiences to my parents at the time, but they did not really take me seriously. I was quite imaginative for my age, so they thought it was just my silly little brain making things up. At the same time, my vision was starting to get bad and I needed to wear glasses. They used to tell me my blurred vision was creating scary monsters with the things in my room. Every time I was seeing the things in my room, I kept repeating my parents' words to soothe me, but I was still so scared, trembling, and unable to sleep because of what I was seeing. I had bad sleeping habits because of that. I had hard times closing my eyes at night, and I always tried to fall asleep before there was no light left in the house. These experiences followed me my whole childhood, but with the years passing by, they were less frequent. The fear of the dark still lingered, but I could sleep more peacefully. When I reached my teenage years, it completely stopped. At times, I was even able to completely forget this part of my life. Funny how I never thought my house was haunted. I always knew deep down that it was my problem to bear. The rest of my family never had any paranormal experiences in this house, and none of them were particularly inclined to hear about my fear of the shadows. Even though I stopped seeing things after my 12th or 13th birthday, I still had quite the instinct for the paranormal, and I was able to feel if a place was bad or not. But I want to make it clear that I was not seeking paranormal thrills. In fact, I was avoiding those things like the plague. I was still very much traumatized, and I did not want to experience scary things like that ever again. So, I cannot recall if it was during my 14th or 15th birthday years, but I had my final, most horrifying encounter. I was on vacation at my friend's grandmother's house. It was quite an old house, and there were 2 beds in this bedroom for my friend and me to go to sleep. I had slept in this room many nights before without anything happening, and nothing during the evening could explain what took place next. I woke up in the middle of the night with no explanation. I don't remember having a bad dream or hearing something. I just opened my eyes in the complete darkness. The feeling of uneasiness crept in very quickly. Something was not right. I could feel it, but I wasn't sure what yet. I finally lifted my head and saw it. Words cannot describe how horrid the thing I saw was, and how terrified I felt in that instant. Just 2 meters away from me, at the end of my bed, stood a man that I can only describe as grotesque. The man had red skin, or so I thought at first, prominent eyes, and an all-teeth smile. It was standing still and staring directly at me. We looked at each other for what felt like hours with no one moving. I was able to see every detail of it. More than 10 years later, I'm able to describe it perfectly to you. Its image is still ingrained in my brain like I was marked by a hot iron. Its red skin was actually no skin at all. It was made out of muscles, and its eyes and teeth were very apparent because it had neither eyelid nor lip. Its face was horribly deformed because there were several metal pieces under its muscles that were coming out at random places. It wore a black leather trench coat. I cannot tell you how terrified that I was. My heart plummeted to my stomach and my body felt an uncomfortable hotness within. It was the first time that I was seeing something so vivid and real, and my instincts were screaming that I was in great danger. I could not take my eyes off of the red man. Somehow I knew that I should not let it out of my sight. I didn't scream or panic, but I frantically searched for the light switch that I knew was within reach. The red man was standing still, just looking back at me. I don't know why, but I knew that it was completely amused by the situation and how scared that I was. Finally, I turned on the light, and I thought that I was saved. Remember how the light always helped me chase away the shadows? Well, this time, it did not fucking work. It was still there. It was still staring at me, and I could see it more clearly than ever. It began to shift away, getting closer to my friend's bed. Speaking of my friend, of course he woke up from the light that I had just turned on. He turned toward me, asking me what was happening. I think he knew immediately that something was very wrong from the face that I was probably making and my eyes locked on something next to his bed. He kept turning his head toward the red man that I was looking at, but he obviously was not able to see it. My friend kept asking what was wrong again and again, more panicked each time he was inquiring. I was so horrified that my lips were sealed, so I was not able to respond. The whole event took less than a minute to unfold, but here I was, completely terrified and spooking my friend to death. Finally, the red man began to fade away into thin air. During all this time, it did not break eye contact with me. It did not move its arms or its legs. It just kept staring at me with its eyes with no eyelids and staring at me with no lips. To this day, I have no explanation for it. It was neither a vivid dream nor a sleep paralysis, and I know what I saw. To further validate my experience, let me tell you another weird thing I experienced not many years ago related to this story. After forgetting about this horrible nightmare for a decade, I happened to tell the story to my father. I was still very surprised by how vividly I could recall the events of that night, and how I could describe its face precisely. I was in an almost trance-like state while taking a bath after that, still thinking about what had happened. I was recreating the red man's face in my head. I began to stare at my own face in the mirror. a mirror that was at least 2.5 meters away from me. I stared at myself for minutes without really thinking about it, just having the red man's face in mind. Somehow, a feeling of uneasiness began to stir in me. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was at first. I kept staring at my face, in my trance-like state, until I finally realized what was not right with the situation. I was able to see my face. Remember how I told you my eyesight was bad? Well, it did not improve with time. In fact, it got really bad, and without my glasses, I can't see things clearly at all. And here I am, in my bathtub, seeing things clearly for the first time since my toddler years. I got really spooked, and the moment that I realized what was happening, I saw my vision getting blurrier and blurrier. I don't know what to make of the last story. I just wanted to tell you everything that happened to me. I have my own theories, but, again, I do not seek any truth, and I still avoid paranormal things like the plague. Well, that's about it, folks. I hope my experience was interesting to some of you. It was weird and unsettling for me to put words to these events. I feel like every time I mention these things, I put myself closer to the shadows and the red man that still haunt my nightmares to this day. As I said before, I did not experience anything relevant after my teenage years, but the fear of the dark and what it hides is still here. My late mother told me her ghost stories from a time when she worked as a charge nurse at a well-known hospital in my state. Please forgive me if the story is hard to follow, as she told me this when I was a kid. In the early 90s, my mother was fresh out of medical school and was fortunate enough to find a job at a prestigious hospital. The only downside of taking this job was the fact that she would be working the graveyard shift. A typical hospital night shift is 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. A couple of months into the job, she found out that one of her good friends from medical school had gotten a job at the same hospital as her. Unfortunately for my mother, her friend had gotten a day shift. On this particular day, my mother's friend ran into some car trouble and couldn't get a ride home. My mom, being the helpful person that she was, told her friend that she could pick her up and take her home before her shift started. My mom picked her friend up and took her home. Her friend was thankful for my mother and insisted that she stay and eat some dinner. My mother couldn't turn down the offer as she had rushed out of the house to go and pick up her friend in the first place. My mom and her friend sat at the dining room table eating dinner. In front of the table in the family room was a large fish tank. Looking at the tank, my mother noticed that all of the fish were pressed up against one side of it. She wasn't really bothered by this, but asked her friend, "Did you forget to feed your fish today?" "Why?" "All your fish are out and pressed against one side of the tank." My mother's friend looked at the tank and laughed. "Maybe it's my uncle. The fish would do that when he would look through one end of the glass." "I thought you mentioned to me that your uncle had passed away when you were in medical school?" "Yeah, sometimes I think he's just standing there looking at the fish, or maybe I'm losing it." They both laughed it off and finished dinner. My mother thanked her friend for dinner and left to make it to work on time. My mother was less than a mile away from work when she saw blue lights in her rearview mirror. She thought to herself, was I speeding? Did I forget to signal? Did I accidentally run a stop sign? All of this ran through her mind as she pulled over. The police officer came out to the car and up to the driver's side window. He shined the flashlight in my mother's eyes and asked for her license and registration. And then, the usual, "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" "No, sir." "Well, the person in the passenger seat is jumping around and clearly isn't wearing a seatbelt." "How can that be?" My mom confusingly looked over to the passenger seat, and of course, the seat was empty. The officer shined his flashlight into the car and froze. My mom turned to look at the officer, who was visibly shaken and pale. After a few seconds, the officer began to mutter, "No, not today," and slowly paced back to his car. In a flash, the officer took off. Must be Uncle, she thought. My mom arrived at work and started with her normal routine. The night shift didn't faze her until around 12 a.m. While finishing some patient paperwork, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted someone walking around in a patient gown. Concerned, she nudged one of her coworkers to check on the patient who was wandering around in the hall. He got up, looked down the hall, and he immediately turned around back towards my mother. There was no one there. Confused, she looked over the desk, and indeed, there was no one there except other nurses and doctors. At around 2 a.m., my mom had gotten tired and decided it was time to get some coffee. She got up from her desk and began walking to the break room. On her way to the break room, she spotted the same patient wandering around the hall. Not wanting to disturb the other patients and nurses, she decided to follow this patient. She followed them until they turned and walked into one of the rooms. She walked up to the room and looked in, expecting to find them. Instead, she walked into an empty cardiology room. My mother walked out and began to think that she was losing her mind. Before exiting the room, she looked at the room number and saw that it read 616. She wrote it down on a notepad and continued with her shift. When her shift ended, she began to put away her work in her locker and pulled out her notepad. She looked at it, and it read Cardiology 616. Remembering what had happened, she used the break room phone and called her friend. Half asleep, her friend answered. My mom began to explain what had happened to her and mentioned her experience with the police officer and her shift at the hospital. Finally, my mom asked, "How did your uncle pass away, if you don't mind me asking?" "Oh, he was having some heart problems and passed away from a stroke." "When you visited him in the hospital, can you recall what room he was in?" I think it was room 616. "I think it was your uncle I saw last night and this morning." "No kidding." My mom always told me that story, and she truly believed that she had seen her friend's uncle's ghost. Though the ghost said nothing to my mother, she could only ponder the reason why. When I was young, I lived in a small, one-story house in a bad community a little ways south of Atlanta, Georgia. My parents bought the house when there were no other houses in the neighborhood, save for one or two neighbors that weren't exactly close enough to really be counted as proper neighbors. Well, by the time that I had come along and gotten old enough to play outside on my own, there were way more houses. It wasn't a huge neighborhood or anything, but it was way more built up than when my parents originally moved there. Behind my house, there were some woods. The woods were pretty dense, and went on for a few miles before there was a middle school and its football field. Sometimes at night, if it was clear, you could see the stadium lights glow way beyond the tree line. Anyways, in these woods I discovered a creek. My parents told me that when they first moved here, there were all sorts of fish and crawdads living in there. But when I first discovered the creek, I found nothing except for maybe a few tiny minnows. Maybe 5 or so spanning a mile, both up the creek from my house and down the creek. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't live in a very good area. The news was always talking about some shooting or drive-by, but where my neighborhood sat, it was usually more tame. This was in the early 2000s, and I didn't have internet or any sort of gaming console, but it was fine because I loved being outside anyways. Even if the mosquitoes were literally the worst, and I have a more severe allergic reaction to their bites. My favorite place to go and hide was out by the creek. But one time I went down, I remember seeing more vultures and scavenging birds flying around and sitting in the trees than normal. But no big deal. It was probably just a dead deer or something. I made my way to the creek and rolled up my jeans to stomp around in the water and kick up mud or whatever I used to do. But before I even finished rolling up my pants legs, I saw something. Still bent over, I was pretty close to a sickly pale, decently fresh-looking, human finger. It startled me for more than one reason, and I shot up like a rocket. There was nothing else around, though. No signs of other people, no blood, no body. Just a finger in the creek behind my house. It bothered me, but I was one of those weird, quiet kids, so it was a few months before I said anything. As it turns out, a few doors down there was a man hiding from the FBI in his sister's house. I never found out if he was an actual killer or anything. But I do remember waking up one night to see SWAT trucks and officers outside. One of the officers knocked on our door to ask my parents a few questions and to check to see if things were all right. And I remembered the finger. Of course, it was months later, so I doubted that it was still there and said nothing. I never heard anything else related to the guy, or the FBI, or the finger. But in my 8, maybe 9-year-old mind, it all seemed connected. And to this day, I'm pretty sure there was a murderer a few doors down from me when I was a kid. This story takes place in 2017. My then best friend, I'll call her Lex, and I were having a sleepover at my dad's house. I was 16 at the time, her being 17. We often had sleepovers on Fridays where we would eat junk food, watch as much Netflix as possible, and have deep conversations. This night was no different, and so unremarkable that I've forgotten everything that we did. That is, of course, until we were trying to fall asleep in my bed. I remember being completely exhausted, slowly but surely drifting off despite sharing a bed with someone. I was just on the brink of sleep when Lex got my attention. First, she simply asked if I was awake. I grunted in response, signaling for her to continue. It should be said that I was quite literally a minute or two away from unconsciousness, so I didn't pick up on her tone of voice or think much about what she said next. "I'm gonna go use the bathroom downstairs," she told me, getting off the bed. This wasn't normal, her announcing that she would be slipping away to use the restroom, but I was too out of it to be annoyed or curious. Not long after she left, probably no more than 10 seconds, it started happening. Again, I was on the precipice of sleep, so my mind wasn't racing with thoughts or in any state to freak myself out. Nevertheless, I became filled with the feeling of impending danger out of absolutely nowhere. I was becoming very lucid very quickly as dread and anxiety overwhelmed me. I had never felt this kind of acute fear before, nor seemingly out of nowhere. Now wide awake, I opened my eyes and stared at the wall. Less than a foot away from my face, as I slept facing away from the bedroom door. My heart raced as I tried to understand the situation, but I didn't move. Something told me that moving would be a very bad idea. My room was pitch black as well, so that didn't help matters. All I could think about was how scared I was, and how I hoped that Lex would return soon. I can guess that a few minutes passed like this when suddenly the bed dipped on the side that I wasn't occupying, as if someone were sitting down. Problem was, not only did Lex struggle to get onto my bed due to its height, but my bedroom door had never opened. At this point I was petrified, and I only became more afraid as I felt something against the back of my body. It felt like a person, just gently pressed against me. I thought to myself hysterically that there was no way this was actually happening. I held my breath to better isolate the feeling, horrified to feel the presence moving as if it were breathing, too. In and out, pressed against me. In and out. The atmosphere is still suffocating in the room, filled with what I can only describe as evilness. The aura of whatever was touching me screamed danger. Don't move. I will hurt you. My mind and heart are racing as I try to think of a way out of this. The only balm I have to lessen my anxiety is the fact that I know Lex will eventually return. But what happens then? She wouldn't see whatever it was pressed against me when she entered the bedroom, too occupied with making sure she wasn't disturbing my sleep. So I told myself that once I heard the door open, I would address her and ask her to turn on the lights. After what I would come to find out was about half an hour, Lex finally did return. The second I heard the door open and light flooded into the bedroom, I called her name. She hesitated, her soft voice saying, "Yeah?" I requested bluntly, "Turn on the lights." She did as I asked, and I shot like a bullet from my previous position, whipping around to inspect the area where I had felt the presence. There was nothing. I wouldn't notice right away, but later I realized that the horrifying aura that was plaguing my bedroom had vanished once Lex arrived. It was gone just as suddenly as it had appeared. Still, I was in a state of horror for the next few hours. We watched some cartoons together and decided to sleep with the lights on, but not before talking about what had just happened. Lex revealed to me that the reason she had gone downstairs wasn't to use the restroom, but to call her boyfriend for emotional support. She told me that she had felt panicked, wanting to leave the room to escape from the stifling feeling. Lex couldn't get a hold of him, and spent the next 30 minutes or so trying to calm herself down. In the morning, Lex and I would confide in my dad, the only other person in the house. He was rightly disturbed and told us that he had a nightmare that night. I can't remember what his nightmare consisted of, only that it was a really bad one. My dad is a veteran, so he is not easily spooked, but it left him uneasy. The fact that my dad had a nightmare at all made this whole experience more notable to me. To wrap things up, I want to say that I had improperly used a spirit board a few years before this with a few of my friends at my dad's house. We were children, so we didn't take it any more seriously than any other Halloween game. Nothing of this magnitude had ever occurred before, though. Just this one night. Lex and I were able to acquire holy water from one of the teachers at our high school after she told him the story. We used it to cleanse my bedroom. Nothing strange has happened to me, or my dad, since. I have an attic in my house, and ever since I was young, I hated going up there. It was dark, because there was no light, and it was always absolutely freezing. It had a really bad energy, and my anxiety would skyrocket whenever I had to go up there with my dad. It felt like someone had set a timer, and time was running out, if that makes sense. It was like I had to get out of there ASAP, or something would happen. In 2016, my parents decided to convert the attic and make it into their bedroom. After this happened, I noticed a lot of unexplainable events. One day I was off from school and I was home alone. I was lying on my bed watching Jeremy Kyle show clips with both of my cats on the bed with me. Then I heard what sounded like someone walking down the stairs from the attic. It's a very distinct sound, and I knew it was the stairs creaking as they were new and didn't normally make any noise. I paused the video and listened. I didn't hear anything, so I continued watching, now a little on edge. 2 minutes later, I heard the footsteps again. Peanut, my cat, started hissing and meowing and went to the end of my bed and hid. At this point, I was tearing up. I somehow managed to get out of bed and pull my dresser in front of my door. I sat in front of the door and called my dad, sobbing. I explained to him what was happening and he said, "Go out of my room and look." Hell no. I begged him to call my neighbors to come in and get me. It was only after I called my dad 5 times, he kept hanging up on me, that he called my neighbors. One of my neighbors, who have a key, came in. I flew down the stairs, sobbing and shaking. My neighbor checked the house, but no one was there. I didn't feel safe staying home for weeks after this. My best friend and I would hang out after school at my house most days, and whenever we did, we would always hear noises from upstairs. One time in particular, we were in the kitchen making noodles, and we heard banging. I assumed it was my cat and didn't think much of it. My friend then shushed me and said to listen. From upstairs, I could hear the sound of someone opening and closing a chest of drawers and slamming my wardrobe open and shut. Now my cats are loud, but how on earth does a cat open up a drawer? It's a very distinct sound. We ended up waiting in my back garden holding a paint scraper and a knife until my dad came home. This is by far one of the scariest ones. My dad called up the stairs to me and said he was going to the shops. Once he left, I went downstairs to grab some food. I asked my sister if she wanted anything to eat, and she said yes. She was in the front room, so I was talking to her from the kitchen. My dad knocked on the door, and I yelled at her to get it. She didn't. I went to answer it, giving it to her for being lazy. When I opened the door, in came my dad and my sister. After months of noises, banging, hearing people talking and walking around when I was home alone, I was sick of it. I felt anxious to be in my own home, and I had other things to worry about. So one day I decided to try to talk to whatever it was that was in my house. I didn't use a Ouija board. I just sat on my stairs and had a chat, I guess. I told him that I respect that they were in this house before I was, but that they were scaring me and stressing me out. I asked if they would be able to leave or at least stop frightening me. After this, I've never had anything happen in my house. No banging or noises. I think that it was the spirits of the previous owners, a nice elderly couple who sadly died in the house of natural causes. I work at a mental health facility. Strange things happen a lot, like doors closing and opening, seeing things out of the corner of your eye. You know, normal, creepy hospital stuff. Well, I had the creepiest experience. One night about a year ago, I'm working on the adolescent unit, night shift. I just saw something move out of the corner of my eye. Then immediately afterward, this girl comes running out of her room screaming that the devil comes at 3:33. She's just repeating it over and over again. We get her some meds, and she goes back to sleep. The next night, it happens again. This time I look back at the clock, and it is in fact 3:33. They don't have clocks in their rooms, and they can't have watches, so there's no way that she knew what time that it was. We played back the camera, and she just went from dead asleep to balls to the wall. So this girl does this every single night for her entire stay, which was about 5 days. During that time, the quote-unquote creepy hospital stuff seemed to happen even more. Random door buzzers were going off, doors were opening and closing, lights were flickering. That creepy being watched, hair sticking up on your neck feeling was happening all the time. Every day she would say that she didn't remember getting up, and had no idea what we were talking about. About a week afterward, she got transferred to a long-term facility. I get called to receive a report for a patient that was being sent to us. I'm reading through the notes, and at the very end, quote-unquote, parents report patient repeatedly says that the devil comes at 3:33. I check the name to see if it's the same girl. It wasn't. I called the on-call physician, and he immediately declined the patient. To this day, all the staff have no idea what happened. My family and I lived at a large property called Gladstone Villa in the former mining town of Bargoed, in the Caerphilly County Borough of the South Wales Valleys in the UK. From 1969 to 1978, we experienced activity that simply defied rational explanation, such as lights going off and on. We witnessed electrical cables being pulled, and my grandfather Bill claimed to have had a glass bottle thrown towards him as he entered the main bedroom, missing him by inches. I didn't personally see this myself, but I still recall the time he came from there with the broken bottle in his hands, and he told us what happened. There was the occasional sighting, but this was very rare indeed, so rare that in all the 9 years I was there, I never once saw it, but I did hear it many times in the bedroom. It's still worth mentioning that my mother, Caroline, saw it on at least 2 occasions. There were also regular footsteps heard in the main bedroom every evening. Sometimes during the day we'd all be downstairs watching TV. One of us would turn the volume down to hear it more clearly, and my grandfather Bill would point to the ceiling and say, "He's by there," or "He's by there now," trying to make out where the footsteps were coming from exactly. There were 5 members of the family that were living at the Gladstone Villa. My maternal grandfather was William Higgs, known as Bill to family and friends, a retired miner who worked at the local colliery. He was a short, bald man who liked nothing more than to listen to his country and western LPs, Johnny Cash, Glenn Campbell, and so on. He also liked westerns on TV that starred John Wayne or Clint Eastwood. My maternal grandmother was Rita Higgs. She was a short woman who was a housewife. She was completely teetotal, but liked to smoke. She also liked collecting garden gnomes and liked watching soap operas on TV. My mother, Caroline Dexter, met my father at the local bakehouse on Baldwin Street. She was day shift regularly, and my father worked the night shift. He would stay behind to make her a cup of tea and chat. They dated for 3 years before they got married on Monday, the 1st of April, 1968. The Beatles were number 1 with Lady Madonna. They did not get a place of their own, but they decided to live with my grandparents at Gladstone Villa, which was in Cardiff Road. I was born on August 24th, 1969, when everyone was listening to the latest number 1 in the charts, Honky Tonk Woman, by the Rolling Stones. It was soon after that my mother said that strange things started to happen. I was just a baby when she said it all started off rather quietly, like small tapping here and there, but nothing too noticeable. But in time, the activity gradually increased. One time, my mother said the family heard a noise like someone jumping down from the attic and onto the landing. Naturally thinking that someone was trying to break in, they went to see what was going on. When they got there, they found no one, but the latch to the attic was open. Whatever it was eventually occupied itself in the main bedroom, which incidentally was my grandparents' room. It soon made its presence felt by walking around the bedroom, and the sounds of dragging could be heard. One day, my mother went upstairs to that bedroom to get my father up for work so he could be ready for his night shift. When she got there, she was confronted by the sight of the ironing board placed on my father's torso as he slept. When he awoke, he was astonished to find the situation he was in. He suspected my grandfather Bill was playing pranks, but in time he knew my grandfather was not responsible for it, and he told his work friends what was going on, and it got around town that Gladstone Villa was haunted. My parents separated in 1972 and my father left Gladstone Villa, but it wasn't because of what was going on at the villa. It was just a breakdown of the marriage. They finally divorced on the 25th of April, 1975. The British band the Bay City Rollers were number 1 in the charts with Bye Bye Bay. Again, very apt. It would have been amusing but for the fact of what was going on there. I was barely 2 years old, so I have no memory of my father living at the villa. But he would come to see me every Saturday to take me to see my paternal grandparents and to the local cinema. Great times, even though the paranormal activity still continued. As I got older, too, I witnessed the activity for myself. I actually saw the poltergeist activity. I watched electrical cables being pulled by unseen forces. I saw the lights going on and off, and when my grandfather Bill would play records on Sunday as the family did dinner, it would turn the music off. It took exception to the British band Slade and any religious TV shows my grandmother Rita would watch. The local police were also involved. I remember them popping their heads into the attic, hesitating and not going in, but they suggested it was my father playing a prank on the family. A family friend, Mrs. Ivy France, she was more of a friend to my grandmother Rita, she was very skeptical when my grandmother told her that Gladstone Villa was haunted. I can remember Ivy going into the main bedroom, looking around and saying it was vibration from the traffic outside causing it, but she was soon to change her mind when she experienced it for herself. It was then she suggested that the local press be contacted, and a medium. The medium was John Matthews, and when he came to Gladstone Villa, he started by asking the family questions. He then began by challenging the spirit to perform by knocking on the ceiling, and sure enough, it responded by knocking back at him. At some point, John went into a trance to try to make contact with it, but he failed to get a name. He later confirmed the obvious, that there was indeed a presence there, and that it was an earthbound spirit, and that it had unfinished business. A priest by the name of Graham Jones was then called to Gladstone Villa. He blessed the property, and after a few prayers, he duly left, and it was quiet for a few short months after that. No incidents. But it did return, and with a vengeance, and this time it decided to show itself. One evening, my grandfather Bill, my mother Caroline, and I were watching television. My grandmother Rita was reading a book, when all of a sudden my mother just so happened to look to her left, and she saw a full, solid figure of a monk standing by the doorway. We did not see this, as we were otherwise occupied, but she later described it in detail as a monk in typical brown habit, complete with hood over the head so she didn't see the face. It sounded very much like a 16th century Benedictine monk. Fred Davies was a friend of my grandfather Bill. They worked together at the local colliery, and he would visit most evenings. Fred was a slim man who would wear a flat cap and glasses and smoked homemade cigarettes that hung from his lips as he spoke. He would sit in his favorite chair by the open fire and talk to the family and watch TV with us. One day, Fred was with us, in his casual place by the open fire. I was quietly playing with my toys by the sideboard. It was tranquil, when all of a sudden there was one very loud bang. It was so loud that Fred ducked his head and I ran to my mother for comfort. When it was gone, we all went upstairs. My grandfather, Bill, would always be the first and I would be the last. When we went to that bedroom, we found nothing that could account for that noise. Fred later told us that he ducked his head as he thought it was going to come through the ceiling. Fred told us of another experience he had at Gladstone Villa. My grandfather Bill liked to look out the landing window that overlooked Cardiff Road and into the Bargoed town centre. This time Fred joined him, and he said that he felt something brush past him, but when he looked, there was nothing there. The most frightening experience I had was when I was alone in that particular bedroom. I made sure the light was on. It was very quiet as usual. I was lying on the bed facing the window that overlooked Cardiff Road when I suddenly felt something heavy pounce on the bottom of the bed. I heard the bed springs go just once, and I felt the bed bounce. I didn't look straight away, but when I did, there was nothing there. I went downstairs to tell my family, and we all went back up. We saw distinctive paw marks on the bed, like that of an animal. I later found out that my grandfather had a black Labrador dog called Toby, who died before I was born. My grandfather Bill and my mother Caroline claimed to have heard a baby crying there, but as I didn't hear it at the time, I took very little notice of what they said. The activity got so bad that my mother, grandmother, and I slept downstairs with the lights on. It was only my grandfather Bill who was supposedly brave enough to sleep in the bedroom itself. It was then that he himself had yet another experience. He told us that he was lying on the bed when all of a sudden he couldn't move. He couldn't even shout for us to help him. This could well have been sleep paralysis, but he said that he heard something in the room with him. My grandmother Rita had her own experiences. One day she went upstairs into that room to get my grandfather up when she saw the boiler door open wide by itself. She didn't stay there to see what it was, but she rushed out. Another occasion, she said she had the sense of something pulling from under her foot, as if she had stepped on someone's gown. We had the ghost for so long that my grandmother Rita gave it a pet name. She called him Johnny, and my grandfather Bill would shout out that name to provoke a reaction, but nothing would happen. Ivy Francis's son, Charles, got to hear about what was going on at the Gladstone Villa, and he came along with some friends, and with my family's permission, they went into the bedroom. It frightened one of his friends, and to this day, his friend still says that it is a spooky place. My mother Caroline had an operation on her and ended up on crutches. The local nurse would tend to her foot. One day she was sitting on a chair when the nurse came, and the nurse knelt down to tend to her, and she told my mother not to hold her. My mother looked at my grandmother Rita in amazement, as she was not holding the nurse at all. My mother made her own conclusions that it was Johnny the ghost that was holding her, so as not for the nurse to hurt her. The only time I heard the ghost being vocal was the time that we were all in the room. One of us wanted to use the bathroom and we couldn't get in there. My grandfather Bill said, "He's behind there." I heard quite distinctively the sound of a Gregorian chant, and that was it. Nothing more. We left in the summer of 1978, when two local businessmen bought the property in Gladstone Villa, was eventually converted into a small hotel and its name changed to Red's Park Hotel. On the night before we moved, there was one final incident that we experienced, as if it knew that we were going and that was its way of saying goodbye. My mother, grandmother, and I got ready to go to sleep. The light was still on, and then we heard the doorknob turning as if someone were trying to get in. At first, I naturally suspected my grandfather Bill, as he was the only one who slept upstairs in that room, and we thought it may have been him playing a prank. I called out to him, but there was no answer. no laugh that would give him away. We then heard our belongings that were packed in the hallway being thrown around. The next day we asked my grandfather Bill if it was him playing a joke on us. He insisted that it wasn't him, and to this very day, I believe him. I had my 40th birthday at Reds Park Hotel in August of 2009 for old time's sake, and it was the female staff that told me about the ghost, and I told them what had happened to me there 30 years before. The staff told me of their own personal experiences, lights going off and on, the odd sighting in a room, a bridge, a bride in white was seen. Again, as with the claims of the baby crying that made no sense to me at the time. I did a thorough research of the property in the Cardiff Road area, and I found out some very interesting things indeed. I found out from the Bargood Library and the local newspaper archives that Gladstone Villa dates back to 1900, and it was named after the former British Prime Minister William Gladstone. I discovered the previous people that lived there. The Kimyett family in 1924, the new married couple Michael and Evelyn Kimyett, and a son named Elvin. He died at the property at just 4 months old, according to the archives of the Cardiff newspaper The Western Mail of that year. This explained the baby my mother and grandfather had heard in that bedroom so long ago. Mrs. Evelyn Kimyett died in 1970, soon after I was born. Maybe this is why all the activity started. I also found that there was a monastery in Baldwin Street, where my parents met and worked, and there's a property directly opposite the former Gladstone Villa property in Cardiff Road dating back to the 16th century. It is now a public house called the Rafa Club. A priest hide is said to be there, but it's sealed up. This explains the monk that my mother saw. What I have said here is true. I wouldn't share this if I couldn't possibly back this up, and I have used real names, as I have nothing to hide, and all I have said can be verified by the family of those people that I mentioned. Sadly, some of the people I've mentioned are no longer with us. I challenge any hardened skeptic and firm non-believer, and I can assure them that they will indeed most certainly question their belief system. Of this, I have no doubt at all whatsoever. In fact, I am 100% positive. Before my best friends and I were separated, one passed away, the other moved away. We used to ride around doing all of the haunted legend places within reasonable driving distances. Sometimes we would drive for a few hours, but most of them weren't scary other than the adrenaline-filled, hyped up, "Did you hear or see that?" that would cause us to get spooked. This one was different. Way different. We were just out of high school, probably 20 at the most, and we were looking for an actually scary place to visit. A lot of people we knew that we were into these kinds of things, so we would always get tips on where to go. There was the original 3 of us that day and another friend that wanted to tag along. After a little drive to our destination, about 45 minutes, we stopped at a Wawa to get gas and grab a few snacks. Like I stated earlier, we were all about 20 at the time, so we were all hyped up because we knew that spooky time was getting close. We'd always pick on that other friend that tagged along. Nothing harsh, but just, you're scared. So I believe it was me that said something along those lines that was overheard by a few people. It got the attention of other people in the Wawa, including these 2 creepy, older guys who seemed like they didn't fit in. Their clothes were all beat up and dirty, and they just didn't seem right for the area, and the time was probably 8 p.m. on a Saturday night. "What's the little one scared of?" asked one of them. I say little because the 3 of us are all abnormally tall. The shortest between us was 6'4", and he was normal, so probably about 5'9". We replied and explained how we got tipped to go to this road because it's haunted. They replied that it wasn't scary, and if we wanted a real scare, we should go to this random road. I forget what it was called exactly, but apparently it's this random memorial statue for a plane crash in the middle of the woods, where crazy things are supposed to happen. We grabbed our stuff, didn't think anything of it. As soon as we left, the group started talking and decided to go with the other road that the guys had hyped up. I know, a typical horror movie what not to do. So we get to the entrance of the road, and already it did not disappoint. There were woods on both sides, not one street light in sight. And I remember there was this, detention center off to the right, in the middle of nowhere. So the spooks already began from the moment that we hit the entrance. We decided to drive down the road and search for the statue. We noticed that there were trees cut down on the side of the road and laying parallel to the shoulder of it. We finally find the statue. About 5 minutes go by in silence, and we decided to enhance the scare factor by shutting the lights off. About a minute goes by and we see a shadow figure pop up from the statue. We all freak out as it starts walking toward us, but it was making movements that no human would normally be capable of. It was dark out, but this thing was black. It was darker than the woodsy sky, so we could make out some of it. It was huge. Like I said earlier, we were all extremely large compared to the average guy, but this thing would have dwarfed any of us. We decided to peel out of there and continue down the road, figuring that it would lead us out. Boy, were we wrong. About 3 minutes go by, and we hit a dead end, which in this case was an open spot in the woods with sand everywhere. The cutout was massive, but surrounded by forest. There were different cutouts, and ways to go from there, and I'm pretty sure the road continued after this cutout, but we were pretty deep in the woods by that point. So we decided to turn around and leave, obviously. After we turn around, we stop to just take in the eerie feeling. The other 3 guys were talking about the shadow figure that we saw earlier, while I happened to catch something out of the corner of my eye. About 40 feet away from me, I see what appears to be a white face, and then another, and another, all surrounding the car. The other guys didn't see them, and I'm rarely ever scared, but seeing me panic, they all knew that something was up. My panic caused them to panic. We then floored it far away from the sand turnaround. We get about half a mile down the road, somewhat near the statue, and pull over to gather our composure before we get out of there. When we stopped, I swear I heard the most typical ghosty, ooh kind of noise. This was now turning into a movie I wish that I was never part of. We were really scared. After finding the way that we had come, we started heading back out. Remember those trees I talked about earlier? They were now laying in the middle of the road, blocking us in, as we all see the white faces or masks that I had seen earlier. Thank God my one friend, the driver, was good at driving and valued safety over his car. We drove on the edge of the woods and felt like we were defying gravity to speed our way out. The car was literally sideways on the edge of the forest. I mean, I could literally stick a single finger out the window and touch the trees. We all made it home safely that night. After doing research, we found out that that spot was notorious in that area for crazy things happening, such as body dumps and murders. Because of the shadow and the ghost noise that we heard, my head, heart, and gut tells me that that place is actually haunted. As previously stated, that place is famous for dumping bodies, along with the plane crash, so there's bound to be some spirits there. I think where we were that night was actually haunted, but we just happened to be there on a night when there were more things going on. I can't say for certain, but I'm 99% sure that we survived one of their setups that night. I'm 100% sure that I will never go back again. I've had a few paranormal experiences in my lifetime. My mom and dad said that when I was little, they would wake up in the middle of the night to me crawling around my nursery and saying a man with glowing eyes was playing with me. They believed it was my grandfather who died when I was born a hallway away, but I haven't seen him since. Anyway, my boyfriend used to live in an old farmhouse built back in the late 1800s with roommates. None of them believed in activity, but I asked about the old barns in the house when I was staying there. I always felt unsettled in the house when I would sleep there and often would wake up at around 3:12 a.m. to pee. But one night I woke up at that time and stumbled down the hall to the bathroom. At the end of the hall was the staircase, which was creaky and old, and I heard it shift. I stopped at the bathroom door and saw the face of an older man peer around the corner. I jumped into the bathroom and shut the door to pee, but felt goosebumps all up my arms and my back. I didn't feel afraid of him. He looked pretty nervous, but it spooked me really bad. I went back to bed and didn't see him again. The next time I stayed there, I woke up at the same time to pee, and I saw him standing against the wall. But this time, he actually reached his hand out to me and motioned to go downstairs. I cautiously went towards him to see him go downstairs, and I peered around the corner to see him facing the door with his hands behind his back and staring at the open field in front of him. This time I noticed that he was wearing glasses and was older, with a scruffy white beard and dirty pants and boots like he'd been working outside. My boyfriend came down and found me, so I went back to bed, but didn't sleep at all. The last time I saw him, I woke up at 3:12 yet again, and rubbed my eyes to feel a really warm sensation around my hand, as though someone with really strong, working hands was grabbing me with both of their hands. But I sat up to see nothing. My heart was beating loud, but I felt safe and calm, and I swear I heard the whisper, "I'll miss you," before I went to look for him. He was in the hallway again, and he tipped his cap before whistling and walking away. I followed him, but didn't see him anywhere, and this was the last night we stayed there before we moved to a different town, into our own home. As crazy as this sounds, I miss him, and he was a sweet soul. I hope the boys that live there don't bother him too much. I asked about him after we left, and visited my boyfriend's friends, and they said their grandfather had died before they were alive, and he was a working farmer whose wife died before him. He loved animals, and wore big bottle glasses. I really think it was him, and that since the boys didn't believe in ghosts, that he just wanted someone to be his friend. My mom and I moved into a house when I was in the 5th grade. For the record, I'm 25 now. And there was a room in the attic that looked like it was actually built to be part of the house and not some makeshift DIY room. The attic was also not your typical attic with a pull-down door, but a walk-through door. Anyway, the layout was that it made an L shape, and all wooden, and the room was obvious at the end of the L. We used the attic for Christmas decorations and whatnot. But anyhow, on with the story. I turned the room into my little hangout area. The only thing in there when we moved in was a wooden table with 4 chairs and then some weird bench that I hear was a bed, but it didn't look big enough. So me and my friends would always go in there to hang out, play games and whatnot. Well, one day I accidentally broke the table and was worried that my mom was going to be mad at me. I don't think she would have cared since the stuff was so old. But out of fear, I just grabbed all the stuff that I owned and left the room, closing the door behind me. I think I remember once going back in there a few years later, like 9th grade maybe, but never actually spent an extended period of time. I would always stack the Christmas decorations in front of the wall and door to it. The year before we moved, we decided to move everything into the garage after Christmas for my senior year in high school. That way we didn't have to deal with it when the movers showed up. We never used the garage anyway, but got rid of lots of stuff the year prior, so we had plenty of room. That was the last official time I saw the door. But the absolute last time I stepped foot in that house, the stuff was all packed away, on the truck preparing to leave, and I was doing one last walkthrough when I decided to go into that room and make sure that I didn't forget anything and leave it behind. I went to go to the attic, and it was missing. Nothing but a blank wall. Like there was no way a room could have ever even have been there. I was shocked and asked my mom, but she had no idea. I even called my friends to verify, and yeah, they all remembered the room, but she didn't. It was odd. Very odd. I never felt anything weird about the room at all. Like, I'm pretty sensitive to paranormal stuff, and this just seemed like some random room. The house, in my opinion, was haunted because a guy hung himself in the living room, but I don't believe that that was connected. This happened around 13 years ago when I was a sophomore in college, attending a liberal arts school in Suffolk County, New York. Within the first month or two of freshman year, I had found myself in a very tight-knit group of fellow theater geeks, 6 guys, myself included, and 1 girl. And they all loved horror movies and ghost stories. I had found my crew. Freshman year was tough, but we all held each other up and made the whole experience more enjoyable for one another. At the beginning of sophomore year, we decided that in October, as the Halloween season was ramping up, we would find a creepy, wooded spot in a nearby town some night and scare the crap out of ourselves. We did some research and found that there was a particularly isolated area about 30 minutes away, infamous for paranormal sightings. Perfect. The 7 of us split into 2 different cars and headed out into the night. Allow me to set the scene. You turn off of a very busy main road, flooded with strip malls and restaurants and whatnot, and you're almost immediately greeted by complete darkness. Again, this area was very heavily wooded. It was essentially a large web of winding roads surrounded by trees. Very few streetlights and very few houses. Without a GPS or a good sense of direction, one could easily get lost in there. We all made sure to have fully charged phones and flashlights just in case, but the goal was to keep driving until we collectively decided to pull over and go exploring. So, per the directions, we made a left off of the main road, driving about 30 minutes or so into this dark network, picking directions at random, just getting intentionally lost. Our cars made a turn and, to our surprise, there was a huge log in front of us. We had reached a dead end of some kind, with nothing but trees beyond it. We all got out to see exactly what this was, stepped over the log, and noticed 2 narrow trails leading off in different directions. This seemed like as good a time as any to grab our flashlights and do some amateur ghost hunting. We flipped a coin and set off on the trail to the right. The trail was so narrow that we had to walk single file to avoid getting whacked by branches. For whatever reason, I ended up in the back. I'm usually pretty rational and level-headed, but I have to say, the further we went in, the more I was overcome with an uneasy feeling. I kept hearing sounds deep in the woods, unable to shake the sense that we were being watched. But I seemed to be the only one who heard these things, so I shrugged it off as my imagination. In any case, the whole point of us being there was to get scared. not to mention the fact that we were 7 able-bodied college students. What would we come across that could take us down? We headed down this trail for about 20 minutes, and just when I thought it would never end, we came to a massive clearing. And I mean massive. It was a large, open field of unkempt grass. Comparable in scope to a golf course, but not nearly as well manicured. The trees surrounded the entire field, which was so large we could not see the end of it from where we were standing. I was so thrilled to get out of that narrow trail, but I don't think any of us were expecting to find an area so vast. One of us looked to the right and said, "Hey, check that out." We all turned and there was an old, dilapidated house several hundred yards away. The house was completely dark with no cars or signs of anyone actually living there. We walked over and shined our flashlights at it, and sure enough, the windows and doors were all boarded up. I peered between the boards on one of the windows, and what I could see was an old white couch covered in plastic, but an otherwise empty room. Whoever used to live there, they were long gone. Because there was no way in, and because we all felt sufficiently creeped out by the house anyway, we all decided to walk closer to the trail we had come in from, have a seat in the field, and figure out where to go next. We walked back towards the narrow trail, but before we could sit, my friend Mark stopped what he was doing. His expression dropped, and he pointed. We all turned, and on a very far side of the field, directly across from where we had come in, we could see someone tall, lanky, and pale dancing among the trees. By dancing, I mean that it was skipping around, grabbing a tree, swinging around it, and then doing the same thing to another one. Basically kind of like a do-si-do type motion. The moon was so bright, and the woods were so dark. It actually took a second for us to really understand what we were looking at. Jay, the 6'4" skeptic of the group, wasn't seeing it. I leaned into him, pointed in that direction, and said, "Jay, look where I'm pointing. Don't you see that?" He squinted a bit, and the second that he did see it, he gasped with everything that he had, clutched my arm, and whispered, "What the fuck is that?" What happened next sent shockwaves through all of us. Whoever it was, they stopped dancing, looked in our direction, and started charging straight at us. Without even thinking, we freaked and ran back to the trail. Yet again, Jay was the only one who didn't see what was happening. He shouted after us, "Guys, what is it? Where are you going?" After about 15 seconds of running like hell, I heard Jay scream, "Holy shit!" I looked back and saw his flashlight following the rest of us into the trail. While the walk into the woods took about 20 minutes, we made it back to our 2 cars, hopped in, and were peeling away in closer to 5. Once we were at a safe distance, we pulled over, got out, and checked in with each other about what had just happened. My heart was pounding, and I knew everyone else was feeling the same way. Nearly 15 years later, we are all still friends, living in different states yet keeping in touch through marriages, divorces, children, etc. But occasionally, out of the blue, one of us will send a group text to the others, something to the effect of, "The woods, that really happened, right?" It most certainly did. That experience is always in the back of my mind, and I'm pretty sure it always will be. Here's the thing that still resonates with me about that night. Whoever that was, they were dancing maniacally in the woods at 1 in the morning, and then ran directly for a group of young adults, not at all fazed by the fact that they were severely outnumbered. Did that thing know we were there from the second we parked? Was it the sound that I kept hearing when we walked the trail? Whatever the case may be, when he came for us that night, you can be sure none of us wanted to stick around to see what he was truly capable of. My family and I moved into a new house. It used to have an attic, but it's been sealed off. After a couple of months into living in this house, sometimes I'm just watching TV and I hear scratching from the roof. I just play it off as a bird, as they're common where I live. After 3 weeks, the scratching has gotten worse and more frequent. It's like it's trying to scratch its way out of the roof. By the way, the attic entrance thing is above the outside of my sister's room. One day my sister tells my dad that the seal is open. My dad gets confused because it was supposed to be sealed off completely. My dad goes to close it and realizes that it's really hard to open and close, so whatever opened it was strong. That's when I start to get skeptical. The same night I go to get some snacks from the fridge, I open it to find out that they are all gone. I thought my siblings must have eaten them. In the morning, my parents are going on about a missing cake. The cake was supposed to be for my niece's birthday. They asked if I had anything to do with it, and I said no, along with all my other siblings. I was getting really suspicious about the attic, so I built up the courage to go and check it out. Note that I am probably the most paranoid person in the world, so I was scared for my life. But my curiosity got the best of me. I get the ladder, a torch, and a knife, just in case. I open the entrance. I shine my torch to see nothing. But as I search more, I see the cake, empty snack packets, dirty clothes, and a short, dark silhouette. It just freezes in place. Immediately I bolt and scream for my parents and tell them everything. They tell me to stay in my room. They go up and check, but there was no one there. I'm still shaken from that moment and get nightmares from it. We have since moved from that home and now live a normal, non-scary life. If you live in North Carolina, then you've heard of Gravity Hill. You can look it up to get information about it. One night it was me, my boyfriend, and 3 of his cousins, and we thought it would be fun to drive out to Gravity Hill and test it for ourselves. Something did, in fact, push us up the hill. Cody's car was in neutral, but something did push us up. And as we got to the top, Cody asks us if we want to go to the house. I asked what it was, and all 4 of them said, in sync, that I had to see it for myself. We drove up there, and as we got to it, it's this very old, abandoned white house. I'd say it was probably built in the late 40s, early 50s, but no one's lived in it for years. I asked him to pull into the driveway, and he did. We sat there for a minute. I wanted to see if anything would happen because I didn't believe them. We were in the driveway for 3 minutes at most when Cody said, "I'm about ready to leave. What about y'all?" As soon as he said that, his headlights dimmed so much we thought they went out. I saw someone in the upstairs window only for a second, but someone or something was standing there watching us. It frightened me so much that it brought tears to my eyes, and I was shaking. We sped off and didn't look back. I still remember the feeling of all my energy leaving my body, and I never want to experience something like that ever again. When I was growing up, there had been a few forests around town that had famous stories linked to them. The people believed that the forests were cursed from the Native American tribes who were relocated from their homes way back when. They said that the forests belonged to them, and when you go in and ignore your gut feeling, those people die in those woods. When my dad and my sister and I moved when I was around 13 or so, we moved to a small town. Across the street was a hill, and at the top stood a blue water tower. I used to hang out in the woods across the street from my house. It was quiet, and the birds always chirped. Other kids were scared of the woods, but I went up there to draw and listen to the birds. Also, because it was at the top of a hill, I could look out and see the entire town and feel the breeze. But when the animals went quiet, it was time to go. When the school year started, I found out that it was an ancient Indian burial ground. Every year our class would go up the hill and learn about it, and the town and the school was actually really respectful of the forest and the hill. We took care of the trees there. If you looked at the ground, you could still see a lot of Native American arrowheads. We never took them home, though, and were not supposed to. I didn't, at least. I would actually go into the forest when I was walking home because the bullies were too scared to go in. I felt safe there, but I also had to remember to respect it. In the forest, we also had wood piles. When we would go into the forest, we would make piles for the local foxes to nest in during the winter time. Once I went to school after retreating into the forest from one of my bullies the other day. A couple of my classmates ran up to me and said, "What did you do, Jacob?" I looked at the kid and said, "Nothing, why?" They looked at each other and said, "Well, something scared him, and we thought you had scared him, in the woods." I said, "I didn't scare him, I just went in there to hang out." It was the time that Jacob threw a rock at me, and I remember it landed to my right, and I hurried up my pace in the woods, and I thought that he had left at that point, like he always did. He screamed "raccoon" at me, and when I reached the top of the hill, I cried and went home because for some reason that time the bullying hurt. Whatever happened to Jacob in the woods, I'll never know. He stopped bullying me from that day forward and said sorry to me and that it would never happen again. He did say something happened in the woods, but he never said by what or who. Just had a look of terror and practically begged me to accept his apology. I told him it's all right and I went on my way. He could never look me in the eye again. That was back in middle school. When I went to college, I saw him at a 4th of July college event. I was going to catch up with him about life and put the bullying behind us. He glanced, but still looked so uneasy that I simply walked by. Also, sometimes my sister would walk home with me after school, only once or twice that I can recall. Every time we entered the woods, she felt lost. I even had her lead us, and she couldn't follow the trail. It's like she kept seeing these invisible trails that went in circles. She started to breathe heavy and cry and said we were lost, and she had an anxiety attack and just told me that we had to get out of the woods. I was totally chill and knew the forest pretty well, and I let us out, and it was easy. It was literally just 3 trails, one from the south, one from the north, and one going up the hill to our house. You could get in and out of the forest in under 10 minutes, from one side to the other. On May 9th of this year, I went to a flea market to browse. I passed by a clear cabinet that held an assortment of old antique dolls, and I was particularly drawn to an old, cracked doll wearing a hat with feathers. As I examined her closer, I noticed that she had a cloth body, but her arms, head, and legs were made of the same type of plastic, or possibly porcelain. I felt very drawn to her and was surprised by her price, only $35. She wasn't in very good condition, and was clearly ancient, based on the cracks on her body and the way that her face is painted on. I returned to the cashier with the doll, and immediately the workers who had been deep in conversation halted and fell quiet. They proceeded to tell me a little more about the doll, who supposedly hexes anyone who inconveniences her. This only made me feel more inclined to purchase her, as someone who is very interested in the paranormal, and as it is part of my faith, Wicca. So I ended up buying her. My younger sister, 11, wasn't very happy that I had bought the doll, whose name was Madame Leonora. She felt very thrown off by the doll's presence and requested that the doll be placed in the trunk on the ride home. I didn't want to upset the doll in case I got hexed, but my parents insisted that I put the doll in the trunk. So I did. That same day, I almost went to the hospital after an accident at my home. Similar disturbing events happened around the home whenever someone insulted Madame or did something she didn't like. These events pose a possible trauma trigger for some people, so I won't specify what the events were here. Just know that they were serious, and they were awful. I began giving Madame gifts and saying good morning and good night to her every day. On the first day that I gave her a gift, a package that I hadn't been expecting for another 2 weeks came in the mail. Every time I give her a gift, she gives me good luck. Madame and I had formed a friendship, but towards late June I began having strange, very specific dreams. In these dreams, Madame would climb down off of the shelf where she lives and escort me outside. We'd light candles and perform a ritual, and then I would bury Madame in a box with the gifts that I had given her over the months. As soon as the dream ends, I wake up. So, with the knowledge that I have because of my Wiccan faith, I decided to hold a seance of sorts in order to communicate with the spirit hosting my doll. I lit a candle and used a pendulum with a board to communicate. The candle flame responded to everything I said, and I have never seen such clear responses through my pendulum before. Based on what I got out of the session, Madame was able to tell me that she would like to be buried, but won't reveal to me why. I've never sensed any negative energy around Madame before, but with each passing day, the air in my room feels heavier, if that makes any sense. I'd like to fulfill her wish and bury her because I think she may be a Victorian mourning doll, but the vendors who sold her have no information on her at all, only that she makes bad things happen. If she is indeed a Victorian mourning doll, it would make sense why she wants to be buried. The only problem is that she refuses to tell me why I have to bury her. If anyone can tell me if there's any danger to burying her, if there's anything I should know about this, or what I can do to identify what time period she's from, I'd really appreciate the help. I was 14 at the time this happened. I had just moved downstairs because I wanted more privacy, as my parents were always checking in on me. I've always been a rebellious kid and wanted to be alone and do my own thing, without anyone telling me not to. I had always noticed strange things happening around my house, and I kept asking my parents if they were going through my stuff in my room. They would always say no, so I always brushed it off. These things still happen to me to this day, like things being moved and waking up in a cold sweat, with no explanation. One night I was on my phone and I felt this feeling of dread and anxiety come over me. I then heard a voice say, "It's okay," and I looked up and a black silhouette of a woman was standing at the foot of my bed. She had no face, but I could clearly see the outline of a petite woman just standing there. I remember feeling very scared, but also very calm at the same time. I was looking at her for 15 seconds before she vanished. I told my parents what had happened, and they were also scared because my dad would always say that he felt a presence in the house. I instantly moved back up to the main floor. I remember telling people about it, and I would always remind them that my parents built the house, so there were no previous owners. People have given the idea that it was my grandma who passed away a year before this happened. I still question if this is true. I've not had anything that intense happen to me again. I still have the nightmares, and also question what she meant. Why was it okay? I remember telling that to myself over and over. I'm thinking of moving back down soon, but for now, I think I'm good. So much can happen in the forest. There are wild animals, possibly bad people, and the unknown itself. While hiking in Switzerland, I decided to see Matterhorn, the famous mountain, up close. As close as I could. So I left the village I was staying in early and walked through meadows, hills, and then up the mountains to reach the plateau. Early in the morning, after just leaving the town, I walked the straight path. Past some houses on the left, town behind, mountain ahead, and forest on the right. In front of the forest, there were a few curious old huts on long legs, ones that you climb up to by ladder. They were all made of round planks and black soot. My imagination immediately called them witch huts, relating them to movies and legends that I knew. They seemed closed, and I couldn't get into any of them, but I felt a slight shiver of excitement, and didn't really want to get in. So I kept on walking. I saw the mountain, met some people, had lunch, and in the afternoon decided to walk back to town. I remembered the way and backtracked pretty much exactly. On my way back, the mountain was behind me, the town ahead, houses and meadows on the right, and black spooky huts on the left. Guiding the entrance, a path leading into the forest. I should note that despite checking out the huts in the morning, I didn't notice that there was a forest path starting behind them. Curious about it, I checked the wooden road signs placed in the vicinity of the huts. To my surprise, the one pointing into the woods said Zermatt, but the one pointing to where I originally came from in the morning said some other town's name. I was very confused. I looked back and looked again, thinking that maybe my brain was tricking me, but I kept seeing what I saw. I stood there while a few hikers passed in each direction. All stayed on the mountain path, nobody went into the forest or looked at the road signs. I sat there in front of the huts and smoked a cigarette. I debated whether or not I should go into the forest, why the signs showed such weird directions. I wondered if there was a reason I should go in. But I was already very tired to the point of my legs feeling weak. So I decided to go back the way I came, to trust my gut and take the most common main path back to town. When I stood up, the signs were different again. There was no way anyone could have rearranged them. No wind or human. I was there the whole time, and the only people who walked by didn't stop at the signs, let alone tinker with them. The one pointing into the forest said some other name, and the one pointing to my starting point said Zermatt like it should. I told this story to my friend in Zermatt, and he just laughed at the idea of paranormal entities trying to lure me into the forest. I did have a creepy feeling about the huts, but at the same time it was a beautiful day. And I still wonder whether there was some kind of adventure waiting for me if I took the forest path. What do you think? I've always felt that someone was watching me, always with me, just watching, but nobody was to be seen. It was one night during a November break after my birthday, around 2:30, when I started to feel sick, so I got up to use the bathroom. My room was in the basement right next to my parents'. I left my room, and we have this hallway. I walked down, and it was pitch black. I was going up to the door that leads to the stairs, and for a quick second, there was just a girl standing there, and then she just floated up and disappeared. I was so scared. but I really had to use the bathroom, and we only have one that was upstairs, so I continued my journey and used the bathroom. It took me about 20 minutes to get my head together, and then I went back downstairs to bed. Since I moved into this house, 3 a.m. has always been scary to me because I hear a lot of things, and my parents just think that I'm crazy. But the clock hit 3 a.m. I was already scared for my life, and I said, I'm just going to try to go to bed. I tried for about 10 minutes, and it felt like I was being watched still, so I said, hello, is anybody there? No one answered, but a moment later my painting fell off the wall and hit the shelf that was holding my mirror, to fall and shatter. I've always had a spooky feeling about that mirror, and I was crying in fear. After I calmed down, around 3:50, I was going to bed again, and I felt a tug on my foot, but just pushed it away. After the third time, I sat up and saw the same girl from earlier. Her bright green eyes glowed, but her long, blue, scruffy dress was beautiful. It was scary, but I felt like I've seen her somewhere, or she looked really familiar to me and looked like a younger version of me. Ever since then, I haven't heard a word or peep out of anything, but I still feel her presence. I work night shift on a unit at a nursing home. I hear and see a lot of weird things, but nothing much with meaning. Me and the other aide were walking down my hall to go check on a fall risk resident when we got in front of the door to an empty room that stays locked. The resident had moved home and no one had been in there since mid-October. I heard 3 distinct knocks coming from inside the room on the door as soon as we walked by. I froze and turned around, and without speaking looked at my friend, waiting for her to say if she had heard it as well, and when she did, I was frozen in fear, knowing that I was not alone in hearing things. Lots of little extra things have also happened. Me and another aide walked by a room when we got bad vibes. It was cracked open an inch, and the door slammed shut suddenly, so hard that it shook the floor. Right next to the room with the knocks, we had a resident pass away. Again, me and an aide walked by. The door was closed and locked, and the handle started jiggling hard and fast. Another time, me and an aide heard snarling growls coming from the dining room all night. The same night when the knocks occurred. There were also instances of running faucets in the residents' bathrooms, in the basement, anywhere that I went, had a resident complaining of water running all night. It was 1999, and I worked night shift in a factory back in Puerto Rico. One night it was just QC and me working in a back dark room of the factory. About 2:30 a.m. I saw a door open, and a pale young lady stepped in and walked in our direction. QC was facing the other way, and I was looking at her from my workstation. I stood up, and that's when I noticed that from the waist down, the woman was blurred. She was dressed in a light blue dress and a cap. As she got closer, she vanished into a mist. I rubbed my eyes and called the QC. I told her what I had just seen, and she said, "It's just your imagination playing tricks." After an hour or so had passed, this tall, dark shape, dressed in a brown mechanic's outfit, got close to me, looking over my right shoulder. I could see it with the edge of my eyes. It wasn't touching the floor. I froze, petrified. For about 30 minutes, it kept moving forward and backward. I finished the work night and went home spooked. Next day I told my experience to everyone, and a mechanic who had worked there for years told me that when he stayed there, an old mechanic who had all kinds of issues was found hung in the same spot where I was working. When I, a 24-year-old female, was younger, around 5, my family moved into an old house on the upstairs floor. An older couple lived below us. This was a long time ago, and I was really little, but I remember this all so vividly. When we were first moving in, my mom had to go up to the attic, which, coincidentally, the door was in what would be my room. She took me and my younger brother up with her because I'm assuming she didn't want to leave us unsupervised. I remember not liking it up there, and then the light turned off. Both my brother and I started screaming about red eyes. I do remember them. It wasn't just one. It was a bunch or a few. I couldn't tell you how many. It turns out that the light turning off was my dad because he didn't think anyone was up there. He turned the light back on and asked what was going on, and me and my brother were still hysterical. The thing is, no one remembers this but me. Not even my brother. I chalk it up to a bad nightmare, except for the fact that I remember every detail. And it turns out a mother had drowned her baby in that attic, and my parents had experiences there as well. I feel like that house was the start of my acknowledgement or awareness of the paranormal. I'm renting a house currently with some of my friends, and since we moved in this summer, there was an attic door that had a lock on it from our landlord. Well, me and my friend got curious and decided to try and pick the lock. We ended up getting the combination, and when we went up there, I took 3 photos. One is of the front window, one of the back, and one was of an odd postcard on the ground. I sent a photo to a friend, and without me realizing, there was a very clear face in the window with distinct features, eyes, nose, mouth, and head shape. Prior to this, there had been no experiences in the house besides some odd noises. My housemate claims he saw the same face in a different window today after we locked the attic back up. I'm scared that we may have woken something, and I honestly want nothing to do with it.